$9 million in hidden funding, 5 minutes of deadly silence, and a congressional hearing room erupting as AOC says 12 words that left Trump speechless and John Roberts pale. But is this real or just political theater? The hearing room was colder than usual that morning. The overhead lights hummed faintly, casting sharp white beams across the mahogany desks and polished microphones. You could hear the soft clicks of pens, the shuffle of paper, the distant cough of someone trying to mask their nerves. The camera lenses tracked slowly from face to face, some stern, some unreadable, others pretending not to watch. Every pair of eyes seemed to avoid the woman sitting at the center table. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat straight, hands clasped loosely, her expression calm, but her gaze locked forward like a blade unsheathed. The room felt heavy, as if the air itself had thickened into something you could cut. Across from her, Chief Justice John Roberts barely glanced up from his notes. His suit was flawless, his tie knotted with surgical precision. His voice, when it came, was smooth, controlled. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, he began, pausing long enough for the echo of his own words to settle in the marble corners. Could you clarify your actual experience in judicial oversight? The question wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It slid into the room like a scalpel, quiet, but cutting, and everyone heard the edge in it. This wasn't about clarity. It was a challenge thinly veiled as formality. A young intern in the back of the room sucked in a breath too loudly. Somewhere to the right, a reporter raised her eyebrows and began typing furiously. No one else moved. No one even dared to blink. Then it happened. A pen slipped from the hand of a committee staffer and clattered onto the floor. The sound cracked through the silence like a gunshot. Heads turned instinctively, some startled, others grateful for a distraction from the mounting tension. But Ocasio-Cortez didn't flinch. She didn't turn toward the sound. Her eyes stayed fixed on Roberts. 3 seconds. 4. 5. The pause stretched so long, it started to feel like a trap, as if the whole room had been baited into holding its breath. On Twitter, a hashtag began to crawl up the trending list, Shocker Roberts vs AOC. Clips of the moment-frozen screenshots of AOC's steady gaze were already being shared with captions like, "She's about to unleash hell and Roberts may regret this." But in that hearing room, there were no hashtags, just a deepening stillness that made the fluorescent lights buzz louder. AOC's lips parted slightly, not to speak but to exhale. The smallest movement yet, somehow it seemed to shift the entire room's center of gravity. A cameraman adjusted his lens, zooming in on Roberts' face. He looked collected, his fingers drumming an idle rhythm on his folder, but his jaw was a touch tighter now. Still no response from her. Not a word. Not yet. Somewhere in the gallery, a man in an ill-fitting suit whispered to his neighbor, "What's she waiting for?" The neighbor didn't answer. Neither did the woman in the corner seat, who'd stopped typing notes mid-word. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, AOC leaned forward just slightly. Her voice, when it came, was even, unrushed. Not loud enough to command the room, but sharp enough to slice through its silence. "Would you like me to speak about my time confronting housing court judges in the Bronx, or would you prefer I outline my investigations into campaign donors who quietly funded judicial appointments?" The words hung there, delicate yet dangerous. You could almost hear the mental scramble as people processed the shift. This wasn't a counterpunch, it was a dissection. Clean, precise. Roberts adjusted his glasses, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "Perhaps you could clarify both," he said smoothly, though his tone carried the faintest edge of hesitation. AOC blinked once. Of course. The way she said it, steady, confident, with a hint of finality, made the hair on more than a few necks stand on end. The hashtag was now top 3. Commentators across platforms were already speculating. Did Roberts just misstep? One tweet read. Another declared AOC's silence spoke louder than words. But in that hearing room, no one spoke about tweets or clips. All they knew was that something had shifted, and no one, not even Roberts, seemed entirely sure which way it would go. As the camera panned back slightly, capturing both figures, locked in their quiet standoff, the room seemed to shrink. Outside, reporters pressed against glass walls for a glimpse of what they sensed was about to unfold. Inside, the stillness persisted, thick, electric, unbroken, except for the faint tap of someone's nervous heel against the marble floor. And then she reached for the manila folder resting on the table. The movement was slow, deliberate. Fingers curled around the edge of the file, the sound of paper sliding against cardboard, whispering into the microphone. No one breathed. Even the overhead lights seemed to dim, though perhaps that was just the weight of collective anticipation. AOC's voice, low and measured, filled the room once more. I believe the record will find this relevant. Her thumb flipped the folder open, revealing a stack of documents neatly tabbed in yellow and red. The camera caught a glimpse of bold letters stamped across the top sheet: Judicial Policy Center. Undisclosed contributions. A chill rippled through the room. Someone in the back row murmured, "She's not holding back." But AOC didn't look up. Not at Roberts. Not at the committee. Not at the cameras. Instead, she said simply, "Let's talk about oversight." And just like that, the air shifted again. No longer heavy, but sharp, charged, like the second before a thunderclap. This wasn't just a hearing anymore. This was the beginning of a reckoning. The air in the hearing room didn't just grow heavy, it pressed down on every chest like an invisible weight. Moments ago, the exchange had felt procedural, almost routine. Now every eye shifted cautiously, unsure where to land. AOC leaned forward slightly, her fingertips grazing the edge of the microphone, and for the briefest moment it looked like even the static hum from the cameras hesitated. Across the room, a reporter scribbled in his notebook with rapid strokes, his hands shaking just enough to smudge the ink. He whispered to no one in particular, "Something is about to explode." His words hung in the charged silence as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez finally spoke, her voice level, but carrying an undertow sharp enough to slice marble. "Do you mean my experience standing shoulder to shoulder with tenants in Bronx housing courts?" she asked, pausing only to let the words settle before continuing, "Or my years of tracking judicial conflicts hidden behind layers of nonprofit shells?" The question wasn't loud, it wasn't theatrical, yet it had the effect of a rock thrown into still water ripples, expanding too fast to stop. Chief Justice Roberts blinked once, his hand shifting almost imperceptibly over the neat stack of notes before him. His brow furrowed, a fraction of movement caught in high definition by the C-SPAN cameras. Viewers at home leaned forward unconsciously, sensing they had stumbled onto a moment unscripted and raw. The hearing room itself seemed to contract. Aides behind both AOC and Roberts stopped typing mid-sentence, their screens reflecting the frozen scene. No one dared make eye contact. The tension didn't feel like the usual congressional theater. It felt alive, volatile. AOC's tone didn't waver. "Which experience would you like me to clarify for the record? The one where I stood in mold-infested courtrooms fighting for single mothers, served eviction notices without cause? Or the one where I uncovered organizations funneling millions into judicial think tanks while decisions affecting millions were quietly handed down?" The words were deliberate, measured. She didn't flinch. Across the chamber, a young Republican aide shifted in his seat, his mouth half open, as if to interject but catching himself. A camera lens adjusted focus with an audible click, zooming in on Roberts' face, just as a faint crease formed at the corner of his mouth, not quite a frown, not yet a smile. The committee members, long accustomed to verbal sparring, found themselves staring at their notepads as if the answers to unspoken questions might appear there. The air conditioner hummed a low mechanical sound that seemed suddenly louder than before. Roberts finally spoke, his voice calm, but edged with something new: caution. "Congresswoman, let's remain focused on the matter of judicial ethics rather than personal anecdotes." His gaze flicked upward, meeting hers for the first time since the exchange began. AOC didn't retreat. She held his stare unblinking. "Of course, Chief Justice, though it's interesting how often the lives affected by these ethics or their absence are treated as mere anecdotes." A subtle murmur rippled through the press section, reporters exchanging glances like players passing signals. A journalist in the back row raised his phone to capture the moment, whispering into his voice recorder, "She's not pulling punches." Then unexpectedly, a faint thud echoed from the far corner. A staffer had dropped a binder. The sound was minor, but enough to make several heads turn before snapping back to the exchange. In that brief distraction, Roberts inhaled deeply, his fingers tightening around a fountain pen that hadn't written a single word since AOC began speaking. She noticed. Everyone noticed. "Would you also prefer I omit the documented overlaps between donations made to Judicial Policy Center affiliates and key rulings penned under your tenure?" AOC asked her words soft, but carrying the weight of a gavel. Roberts shifted slightly in his chair. It wasn't much, but in a room hyper-attuned to every nuance, it was enough to spark a flurry of texts from reporters to their editors. "Something's happening here," one message read. AOC's hands remained still on the table. She wasn't grandstanding. She wasn't raising her voice or gesturing wildly. And yet it felt like every word peeled back a layer of protection from an institution that rarely found itself under such a public lens. Or perhaps, she continued, we could discuss how nonprofit structures obscure the true sources of financial influence over rulings impacting millions of working Americans. Roberts exhaled slowly, setting his pen down with careful precision. His response came measured, almost rehearsed. "Congresswoman, I maintain that the court operates within the highest standards of integrity. Any implication otherwise would be regrettable." He didn't sound rattled, but something in his eyes betrayed a flicker of calculation. AOC inclined her head, her expression unreadable. "Regrettable indeed," she replied softly. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was dense, electric, like the charged air before a summer storm. In the back of the room, a congressional aide whispered to a colleague, "This isn't over. She's holding something back." The colleague nodded, eyes fixed on AOC. Viewers across the country were no longer passive. In living rooms from Detroit to Dallas, people paused mid-bite, fingers frozen over remotes and phones. Comment sections exploded as clips of the exchange began circulating on social media, each post captioned with variations of one question. Did she just corner the Chief Justice? The hearing chair, sensing the shift, cleared his throat but didn't interrupt. He knew better. This wasn't procedural anymore. This was personal. And as the cameras zoomed in on AOC's calm face, juxtaposed against Roberts's now tightened jawline, one thing became clear to everyone watching. The fire wasn't in her voice. It was in her restraint. And in that restraint lay the promise of something bigger, something no one in that chamber was ready to confront. But before the cameras, the microphones, and the cold air of congressional hearings, there was a different kind of silence, the kind that hummed under buzzing fluorescent lights and broken faucets. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stood behind a chip bar counter in the Bronx, her apron still damp from a spilled beer order. In her left hand was a cocktail shaker. In her right, a folded packet of notes printed from the law library's shared computer, double-sided to save paper. Her thumb traced a highlighted line on eviction protection clauses, but her fingers trembled just enough for the glass beside her to clink. The Friday night crowd behind her laughed, cursed, argued about the Yankees. She barely heard it. She was mouthing legal terms to herself under her breath, again and again, trying to make them feel like something she could say out loud, say with certainty, in front of a judge someday. "You okay?" the bartender next to her asked. She nodded, even though she wasn't. "Just tired," she said. But she wasn't tired. She was terrified of being too late, of being too poor, of being too loud, of being not enough. She would read that same packet 5 times that weekend, at the laundromat, on the train, in the back stairwell of her apartment building, where she could think without waking her mother. The words never got easier, but she read them anyway. Every page felt like a door she wasn't supposed to open. Every clause a reminder that people like her weren't expected to speak the language of systems built without them. Still, she kept reading. Months later, she sat cross-legged on the floor of a dorm room that smelled like instant noodles and metal-framed textbooks. She was 19. Her laptop dinged with a notification she almost missed. The subject line read, "Full Need-Based Award Confirmed, Rhodes College." For a few seconds, she didn't react. Then she burst into tears. Her roommate didn't even ask what happened. She just handed her a half-empty bag of kettle chips and said, "Guess you're leaving us." AOC shook her head through the tears. "No," she whispered. "I'm just getting started." The scholarship didn't erase anything. She still worked 2 jobs, still sent money home, still skipped meals more often than she admitted. But it carved a crack in the wall, a crack she never stopped pushing through. One night she stayed up until 3:00 a.m., drafting an op-ed about racial disparities in school discipline policies. She didn't think anyone would publish it, but when a professor slid it back across her desk with a handwritten note, "This is more than writing. This is a warning shot," she realized words could cut through more than just silence. Years later, the bar was gone. The dorm was gone. but the feeling the sharp edge of being underestimated was still right there, tucked under her ribs, like it had never left. She felt it every time someone raised an eyebrow at her credentials. Every time someone in a tailored suit leaned back and asked, "Where exactly did you go to law school again?" She never answered with a school name first. She always started with the Bronx. And now in this room under the harsh white lights and in front of millions watching from their living rooms, she reached slowly into her briefcase and pulled out the folder. Her hands no longer shook. Her voice didn't break. On the cover of the folder, Judicial Policy Center, undisclosed financial ties. The words were printed in plain black ink. No fanfare, no branding, just facts. She placed it on the desk in front of her like a quiet statement. No explanation, no need. The title said everything. Across from her, Robert's eyes flicked toward it, but didn't stay. For the first time that morning, he adjusted his posture, not from discomfort, but from preparation. Something had shifted. The mood didn't change because someone raised their voice. It changed because a woman no one expected to make it this far had just laid the blueprint of the entire conversation in front of the most powerful judge in the country and did it without blinking. And suddenly, what had started as an inquiry began to feel like a confrontation decades in the making. The room was still humming with the residue of her last words when AOC's fingers brushed the edge of the folder. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't tentative, it was deliberate, almost surgical. The cameras didn't need a cue. They zoomed in instinctively as her thumb flipped the clasp open, revealing the first set of documents. Across from her, Roberts' gaze remained fixed on the table in front of him, but the faintest movement, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw, betrayed that he was listening closer now. AOC's voice, calm and steady, cut through the stillness. "Truth doesn't require ceremony," she said, her tone precise but unraised. "It requires daylight." For a moment, it wasn't clear if she was speaking to Roberts, to the committee, or to the millions watching from their living rooms. The ambiguity made it land harder. The first page slid out like a card drawn in a high-stakes game. It was a list columns of names, dates, and numbers. Organizations with sterile-sounding titles that at first glance meant nothing to most people. But the dollar amounts beside them didn't need context to spark reaction. $250,000, $675,000, $1.1 million. The ink was black, the numbers bold. At the top of the page, a header read, "Judicial Policy Center, undisclosed contributions to affiliated organizations." The effect on the room was immediate. A journalist in the press box leaned forward so far his glasses slipped down his nose. He muttered to no one in particular. "She brought receipts, actual receipts." AOC continued without pause, as if she hadn't just shifted the entire axis of the hearing. These contributions, she said evenly, were funneled through nonprofits with overlapping leadership to entities filing amicus briefs in cases presided over by Chief Justice Roberts. Some of these organizations, she gestured to the page, failed to disclose their financial backers during relevant periods. Her finger tapped the table, once the sound small but resonant in the otherwise silent room. The committee chair's hand hovered near his gavel but didn't move. He seemed unsure if he should intervene or let history play out. On the opposite side, Roberts cleared his throat gently. It was the only sound he'd made in several minutes, but in the vacuum of the chamber, it carried weight. His hands rested flat on the table fingertips, barely touching the surface. He didn't speak, not yet. AOC's eyes didn't leave him as she slid a second sheet forward. "Here we see a $900,000 donation recorded within the same fiscal quarter as a 5-4 decision that benefited an affiliated corporation," she said. The detail wasn't shouted, it was laid down like a chess piece. Her voice held no accusation, only facts delivered with clinical precision. Behind her, a staffer whispered nervously to a colleague, "She's not stopping." The colleague didn't respond. His eyes were locked on Roberts, whose posture had shifted ever so slightly, shoulders no longer square, one hand now gripping the pen that moments ago lay untouched. In the gallery, another reporter was already typing furiously on a laptop balanced on his knees, the headline drafting itself, "AOC links undisclosed judicial donations to key rulings." He didn't stop to check his spelling. He didn't dare look away. The audience outside the chamber was just as transfixed. Phones buzzed in kitchens, living rooms, and office cubicles as push notifications began rolling out. Breaking Ocasio-Cortez presents Documents on Judicial Contributions. On Twitter, clips of the exchange sprouted like wildfire, each accompanied by captions more incendiary than the last. Is this the end of Roberts' credibility? She's holding the receipts they never expected to see daylight. And through it all, AOC's demeanor remained unchanged. No raised voice, no pointed finger. Just an unbroken line of calm, a hand steady on the next page of evidence. The stillness wasn't emptiness, it was tension, so sharp it could split wood. She looked up, her gaze cutting across the room like a scalpel. "Shall I continue?" she asked softly. The words weren't defiance. They weren't even a challenge. They were a promise. Roberts finally spoke, his tone low, but carrying. "Congresswoman, I trust you understand the seriousness of making implications of misconduct at this level." His words were precise, practiced, yet there was a faint tightness in his throat that wasn't there before. AOC tilted her head slightly. "With respect, Chief Justice, I'm not implying anything. I'm citing publicly available filings that have until now remained curiously unexamined." The pause after her statement was long enough for the faint sound of camera shutters to fill the void. Somewhere in the press section, a pen clicked loudly, followed by a whisper. "This is different. She's not playing to the cameras. She's playing to the record." The chair leaned back, his face unreadable. Committee members shifted in their seats, some crossing their arms, others staring down at papers they weren't reading. One aide in the back pulled out his phone and began recording surreptitiously. It didn't matter that the hearing was already televised. This felt closer, rawer, like catching lightning in a bottle. And then with the slightest movement, AOC reached for the next folder. It was thicker than the first. The gold letters on the tab caught the light. Exhibit B. Timeline of financial overlaps. She didn't speak immediately. She let her hand rest there, fingers drumming once, twice on the cardboard as though keeping time. Across the table, Roberts' eyes dropped to the folder and then flicked back up. For the first time, his expression was harder to read. Not calculated, not calm, but something caught between calculation and caution. As the cameras zoomed to capture this micro shift in demeanor, a single thought seemed to pass collectively through everyone in the room. Whatever was in that folder, it wasn't going to leave quietly. The air inside the hearing chamber felt heavier now, almost viscous, as if every breath had to be pulled through layers of unsaid words. Robert's voice broke the tension with a calculated calm, his tone unshaken but edged with steel. "Congresswoman, you're making dangerous implications," he said, each syllable measured, rehearsed, as though spoken from the safety of decades spent above reproach. Cameras caught the faint twitch at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, not quite a scowl. AOC didn't blink. Her reply came quiet, almost gentle, but with an undertow strong enough to drag the room with it. "Dangerous only if they're true." For a heartbeat, the chamber seemed to freeze. Chairs that had creaked moments before stilled. Aide fingers hovered over keyboards, unsure whether to type or just listen. In the press gallery, a reporter's pen paused mid-sentence as he mouthed the line silently, already imagining it as tomorrow's headline. Somewhere in the back row, a young congressional staffer whispered, "Did she just say that?" But no one answered. They were all watching the same thing unfold, the slow, deliberate shift of a room from detached formality to electric unease. Across the street, the ripple was already spreading. CNN interrupted their midday panel with a breaking ticker. AOC challenges Chief Justice in hearing over judicial donations. Fox News wasn't far behind their lower third banner, reading Ocasio-Cortez accuses Roberts of ethics breach. MSNBC's Chiron was quieter, but sharper. Receipts in hand, AOC confronts SCOTUS chief. In newsrooms nationwide, editors barked orders, interns sprinted between desks, and producers called for clips. The hearing had crossed the invisible threshold from political procedure into spectacle. Back in the chamber, Roberts adjusted his glasses with a practiced gesture. "The court's integrity rests on facts, Congresswoman, not conjecture," he said, eyes narrowing slightly. His words echoed off marble walls, steady but strained, as though the foundation he spoke of had a hairline crack no one was supposed to see. AOC leaned forward, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Her voice didn't rise, didn't falter. "And facts," she said softly, "don't usually hide in the footnotes of IRS filings." The subtle murmur that followed wasn't loud enough to draw the gavel, but palpable enough for the cameras to pick up the shifting postures, the tightening jaws, the darting eyes. A congressional aide sitting 2 rows back typed a message under the table. This isn't just about Roberts anymore. Another seated closer to the center watched the exchange with a clenched fist under her chin, whispering, "She's laying down a trail." In the gallery, a veteran journalist leaned toward his younger colleague and said without breaking his gaze, "Remember this moment. You'll quote it for the rest of your career." His colleague nodded silently. Phone raised, already live streaming to a growing audience online. The chat scroll raced by with comments, "She's fearless." Finally, someone asking the questions we're all thinking. This is political suicide or genius? Maybe both. Outside, the streets of Washington began to hum with a different kind of energy. News trucks repositioned, more reporters flooded onto the Capitol steps. Protesters with hastily scrawled signs gathered near barricades, unsure yet what they were protesting, but drawn by the sense that something big was cracking open. Back inside, Roberts's fingers drummed once on the table before going still. His gaze didn't waver, but his next words carried an almost imperceptible pause between sentences. "These are serious accusations. I advise caution before continuing down this path." It sounded like a warning, but the careful phrasing couldn't disguise the slight tremor in the delivery. AOC nodded once, not in agreement, but acknowledgement, her eyes locked on his. Caution, she echoed, her tone almost reflective. It's how systems survive. But transparency, that's how people do. The phrase landed with the weight of inevitability. As if on cue, the committee chair shifted in his seat, his hand inching toward the microphone before pulling back again. He seemed to realize too late that there was no regaining control of a room that had already been claimed. And just beyond the chamber doors, the building seemed to vibrate faintly, not from noise, but from the weight of attention, gathering on its stone walls, 1,000 cameras and eyes waiting for what would come next. As the last syllable of AOC's reply dissolved into the air, the ripple outside the chamber turned into a wave. Screens across the country lit up with push notifications, each headline more charged than the last. On Twitter, Joshua Roberts' receipts surged past 1 million mentions in under an hour, trending globally as users dissected every frame of her calm delivery and every micro-expression on Roberts' face. TikTok clips began appearing within minutes, stitched together with captions like, "She said what?" and "AOC just cracked the Supreme Court's facade." A 16-second clip of her laying down the folder became the centerpiece, looped endlessly, scored with dramatic audio. Viewers watching from break rooms and kitchen tables commented in real time, their words racing faster than the live stream itself. Inside the hearing, the tension grew physical. Chairs creaked under shifting weight. Pens tapped nervously against notepads. And Roberts, for the first time that morning, reached for his water glass with a hand that didn't quite hide its tremor. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, but the cameras caught it, zooming in just enough to make it a GIF within minutes. In the press gallery, a journalist whispered, "This isn't just a hearing anymore. It's an inquisition." His colleague nodded without looking up, thumbs flying across his phone screen to send another update to the newsroom, Roberts visibly shaken as AOC escalates. In the hallway beyond the chamber doors, aides huddled in tight circles, their voices lowered but urgent. One staffer murmured, "If this keeps going, we'll need a contingency plan." Another shook her head. "There's no containing it. Not now." Further down the hall, a young reporter was on the phone with her editor, her words clipped with adrenaline. "It's not just the documents, it's how she's delivering them. Calm, surgical, like she's not even trying to make a headline." The editor barked back, "She doesn't have to. The internet's doing it for her." Fox News ran a chyron in bold red, AOC's attack on SCOTUS sparks outrage. MSNBC countered minutes later with Ocasio-Cortez unveils hidden judicial money trail. CNN, straddling the line, opted for Congresswoman questions Supreme Court ethics in heated hearing. Each network replayed the clip frame by frame, analysts parsing her words with the intensity usually reserved for military briefings. Back in the chamber, Roberts cleared his throat before speaking, but the sound cracked faintly at the end. "Congresswoman!" He began, his voice even but softer than before. "These are extraordinary claims requiring extraordinary evidence." His hand gripped the base of his glass tighter this time. AOC met his gaze without flinching. "Extraordinary only in that they've been ignored this long. She said, her tone still measured. She slid another document forward. The papers whispered as they moved across the oak surface, the sound oddly loud in the hushed room. An aide behind her leaned slightly toward another, his whisper barely audible. She's dismantling the image, piece by piece. The other nodded, eyes locked on Roberts, whose fingers now tapped in a slow, uneven rhythm against the wood. It wasn't lost on the cameras. On social media clips of that tapping, multiplied, captioned, "When the gavel's on the other bench." Viewers outside watched with bated breath. In a coffee shop in Chicago, patrons crowded around a phone streaming the hearing live. An older man murmured, "She's doing what no one's dared." In a law school common room in Berkeley, students debated in hushed tones, one saying, "This is unprecedented," while another replied, "It's about time." The viral storm wasn't limited to political circles. It had spilled into workplaces, classrooms, and even family group chats. Screenshots of the folder covered Judicial Policy Center. Undisclosed financial ties circulated with captions like, "This is bigger than we thought." Roberts took another sip of water, slower this time, as though measured pacing might steady his hand. His lips pressed thin, his brow furrowed almost imperceptibly. Across from him, AOC sat motionless, her expression unreadable, her presence quiet but undeniable. In that stillness, the balance of the room seemed to tilt, not loudly, not suddenly, but enough for everyone to feel it. And as the cameras panned slowly from one face to another, capturing every flicker of unease, every tightening jaw, the realization settled like dust after a collapse: this was no longer a hearing. It was the opening act of a reckoning no one had planned for. The cameras caught the faint quiver in Roberts's hand as he set the water glass down. But before the room could fully register it, the narrative shifted, not in the hearing, but in the minds of those watching. Images emerged side by side as if memory itself was projecting two lives onto the walls of the chamber. On one side, a young John Roberts walking briskly through the manicured quad of La Lumiere, the private boarding school, where tuition rivaled the yearly income of most families in Toledo. His uniform was pressed, his shoes polished to a mirror finish. His father, an executive at Bethlehem Steel, had paid for all of it without hesitation. The dining room at home was lit with soft, chandelier-light conversations, polite and measured, no raised voices, no talk of overdue bills. He graduated with honors, the Harvard crest stitched neatly onto his future, before he ever stepped foot in Cambridge. On the other side, a teenage Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez balancing a tray of plates in a Bronx diner. The smell of bleach and fryer oil clung to her apron as she tried not to let her hands shake from exhaustion. Her mother was on the late shift washing dishes at another restaurant. Her father had been gone for years, taken too early by lung cancer that insurance barely covered. Their apartment was small, the walls thin enough to hear neighbors argue through the night. She studied at the kitchen table under a flickering light bulb, her textbooks wedged between unpaid utility bills and her mother's secondhand cookbooks. Who gets to ask questions without being labeled disrespectful? The thought repeated like a heartbeat, a motif threading through both stories, linking privilege to presumption and grit to survival. Roberts never had to ask that question. In his world, inquiry was expected, rewarded, a sign of intellect. For AOC, asking too many questions as a child often earned her sharp glances, sometimes even sharper words, "Know your place." Yet here she was asking them anyway, her voice steady in a room built to silence people like her. The memory flickered back to Roberts' Harvard Law, where he stood in wood-paneled classrooms debating constitutional theory under portraits of former deans. He clerked for Justice Rehnquist, then moved seamlessly into the Reagan administration. His mentors were senators and judges, his colleagues future partners at the nation's most powerful firms. His phone calls were returned within minutes, his name carried weight before he'd argued his first Supreme Court case. Cut to AOC, her first apartment after college, a cramped walk-up with peeling paint and no heat in winter. She'd wait tables during the day and pore over legal statutes at night, her laptop balanced on a crate that doubled as a coffee table. One December, she received a notice to vacate after her landlord decided to sell. She argued her own case in housing court with shaking hands, winning a short reprieve. The judge barely looked at her when granting it, as though surprised she'd bothered to fight. In the hearing room, that unspoken divide seemed to vibrate in the air. Roberts's eyes flicked briefly toward AOC's folder again, his expression carefully neutral. She caught the glance but said nothing, her fingers resting lightly on the papers, as though waiting for the right moment to reveal the next layer. "Do you think fairness is something inherited, Chief Justice?" she asked suddenly, her voice soft but cutting. Roberts blinked once. "Fairness is a principle of law, not circumstance," he replied, his tone measured, though a faint tightness edged his words. From the press gallery, a reporter whispered into her recorder, "This is no longer about documents. This is about history clashing with itself." In living rooms across America, people leaned closer to their screens. Some nodded in silent agreement. Others shook their heads, fingers poised to type their outrage into the nearest comment box. But no one turned away. The question lingered, echoing far beyond the chamber. Who gets to ask questions without being labeled disrespectful? The air was thick, too heavy for the room's size. Roberts's knuckles rested white against the polished wood, but his eyes remained locked on the woman across from him. AOC's voice didn't waver. "Do you know what it's like to plead for bond at 5 p.m. on a Friday?" The question floated over the panel like smoke curling into every corner. One by one, heads turned toward her, some in curiosity, others in discomfort. She didn't wait for an answer. Her fingers tapped once softly on the folder before her, as though keeping time. "You don't. Because in your world, no one's freedom ever depended on whether a judge was in a rush to make their golf tee time." Roberts's expression didn't change, but his hand moved slightly, thumb circling the rim of his glass, as if tracing the shape of words he couldn't yet speak. In the second row, a committee member leaned closer to a colleague, whispering just loud enough for a nearby reporter to catch. "This feels historic." The reporter didn't look up. She was already typing, her fingers moving fast, the headline forming in her mind before the quote left her ears. AOC leaned forward slightly. Her tone remained level, but each word landed heavier than the last. "I've watched mothers sleep on courtroom benches, waiting for news of sons held without charge. I've read plea deals out loud to teenagers, too scared to look up. I've argued for stays in courthouses where the ceiling leaked on the transcripts." Her hands stayed still, folded neatly on the desk, as if to underline her point. "So when we talk about conduct, Chief Justice, let's be honest about who pays for a lack of it." The room shifted again. It wasn't just the audience anymore. Even committee members who had spent years in hearings like this began to sit straighter. Their pens stilled mid-notes. A low murmur rippled through the press box, not loud enough to warrant a gavel, but too present to ignore. Somewhere near the back, a junior aide pulled out her phone to record, fingers trembling slightly as the screen lit up with comments flooding in, she's cutting through him like glass. "Is this the moment history rewrites itself?" Roberts cleared his throat softly, but it sounded louder than he likely intended. "Congresswoman," he began, the words slow and deliberate. "We must be careful not to confuse advocacy with objectivity. The judiciary's integrity depends on." AOC interrupted, not sharply, but with a calm finality that turned every head. "Integrity is not the absence of noise. It's the presence of accountability." The words hung there, dense as stone. Roberts exhaled, a faint crease forming between his brows. Cameras caught the subtle twitch in his jaw, a movement quickly looped and captioned online, the crack in marble. The chatter outside grew louder. CNN switched to a split screen, showing the hearing live on one side and public reaction tweets on the other. Fox countered with a bold Chiron, "AOC disrespects Supreme Court traditions." MSNBC kept it simple, Ocasio-Cortez questions Roberts' legacy. But inside the chamber it was silent again, thicker, heavier. Every word now felt like it could tilt the room's balance further. The stillness cracked when AOC reached for the second folder. It was thicker than the first, its edges slightly worn from repeated handling. She placed it on the desk with deliberate care, the sound of cardboard brushing oak audible in the tense chamber. Inside are 5 Supreme Court decisions authored by Chief Justice Roberts. She began, her tone even. Each ruling aligns within the same fiscal quarters as significant undisclosed contributions to affiliated organizations. She flipped the folder open, the movement slow enough for cameras to catch every detail. Across the room, Roberts shifted in his seat, his hand tightening around the glass of water. She laid out the first document, a timeline marked with dates, case names, and dollar figures. "Vanguard Medical vs. Reeves," she said, eyes steady. "Filed amicus briefs by groups receiving $1. $2 million within the quarter the decision was drafted. Outcome favorable to donors." A murmur rippled through the room. A journalist in the press box typed rapidly, not pausing to look up. His screen glowed with the words, "This isn't a hearing, it's an earthquake." The second document followed Telford Energy via Adams. Her voice remained calm, her hands precise as she slid papers forward. Undisclosed funds $854,000. Decision 5-4 benefits to entities with overlapping leadership. Roberts inhaled through his nose, barely audible, but caught by the sensitive microphones. Committee members exchanged glances. Some leaned back as if physically distancing themselves from the evidence piling up on the table. Others leaned forward, knuckles white, as they gripped their pens. In the back row, an aide whispered to another, "She's going for a second hit." The reply was equally hushed, "It's landing." The third case appeared, Concord Financial v. Lopez. AOC didn't look at her notes as she spoke. Amicus support from groups funded by $1.5 million undisclosed donations in the preceding months. The dollar amounts were stark against the white paper black ink like small detonations on the page. Robert's voice broke the silence. These associations are circumstantial at best. His words were deliberate, his posture unchanged, but the slight quiver in his left hand betrayed him. AOC didn't flinch. Circumstances. Chief Justice become patterns when repeated enough times. The fourth and fifth cases followed, each accompanied by a quiet recitation of dates and donations. 5 rulings, 5 overlaps, 5 examples where transparency would have spared us this discussion. Her eyes swept the room, stopping briefly on each member before settling back on Roberts. A camera zoomed in on the beads of condensation forming on Roberts's glass, his thumb smearing the surface as he rotated it unconsciously. The feed was broadcast live, split screens showing reactions from pundits already speculating on what this meant for judicial independence. In the hallway, aides and reporters crowded around their phones, their faces pale in the glow of breaking news banners. "Did she just accuse him outright?" one asked. "She doesn't have to," came the reply. "The receipts are doing it for her." Inside, the air felt charged, ready to ignite. AOC's hand hovered over the folder, her fingers resting lightly on the next page. The room held its collective breath. The morning after the hearing, the Supreme Court's official letterhead appeared across news broadcasts and social media feeds. In neat serif typeface, the statement was short but loaded. "The integrity of the court must remain free from political spectacle," it read. While oversight is respected, attempts to undermine judicial independence through inflammatory assertions serve no one. The signature at the bottom was crisp: John G. Roberts, Jr., Chief Justice of the United States. Cable networks broke in with breaking news chyrons. Fox labeled it a strong rebuttal, CNN framed it as Roberts responds to AOC's challenge, and MSNBC called it a defensive move from SCOTUS. But the reaction outside the insulated marble walls was anything but quiet. On Twitter, hashtags multiplied like aftershocks. Nerdy, not above the law. G to receipts, not rhetoric. Jury Roberts. Response. Millions debated the meaning of the phrase political spectacle. In a Detroit barbershop, a man with salt and pepper hair shook his head at the television. "Spectacle," he said, his voice low but tight. "They call it spectacle when a woman refuses to bow her head." In a San Francisco co-working space, a young activist scrolled furiously through comments. "They're trying to bury it," she said. "We can't let them." Reporters reached out to AOC's office for comment, but the Congresswoman remained silent. There was no press conference, no tweet, no follow-up interview. Instead, her staff quietly fielded calls from constituents, journalists, and allies alike, their office phones ringing nonstop. One aide hunched over his desk, surrounded by printouts, muttered to a colleague, "He thinks the statement will calm this down." The colleague replied without looking up, "It won't." In D.C., law professors drafted op-eds overnight. Some praised Roberts' effort to uphold institutional dignity. Others criticized what they saw as a calculated deflection. Headlines flooded in the court's response. Dignity or defensiveness, and Roberts draws a line. But is it too late? On college campuses, students dissected each word of the statement like scripture. A Yale junior asked in a seminar, "Isn't silence complicity or is silence strategy?" A peer countered, "Depends on whose silence we're talking about." In the hearing's viral clips, Roberts' composed voice reading the statement was set against AOC's earlier calm but unflinching delivery. TikTok edits layered her words. Truth doesn't need permission over the image of the press release, juxtaposing institutional power with grassroots anger. Outside the Supreme Court, protest signs began appearing. Some were neat and printed. Others were scrawled hastily. Ethics isn't partisan, and accountability is not a spectacle. Inside the court, whispers grew louder among clerks and aides. One clerk, speaking to a journalist under condition of anonymity, said the chief thinks he's putting out a fire. He doesn't see the forest already burning. Back at AOC's office, her chief of staff looked over at her as she sat by the window, expression unreadable. "They're expecting you to respond," he said quietly. She didn't move. "Not yet," she replied. "Let them speak first." Outside, cameras continued to flash, reporters calling out her name, their voices muffled by the thick glass. The newsroom lights never dimmed as journalists waited for a response from AOC. Cameras stationed outside her office caught nothing but aides coming and going, faces unreadable, hands full of manila folders and coffee cups. Reporters murmured into their microphones about the unusual silence. "She said nothing for 48 hours now," one correspondent whispered, as if loud words might break the spell. Inside, the congresswoman sat at her desk, blinds half drawn, her laptop open but untouched. Her phone vibrated with incoming calls, pundits, supporters, skeptics. But she didn't reach for it. Instead, she stared at a single line of text drafted hours earlier but never sent. Her chief of staff peeked into the room. "They're asking if you'll make a statement," he said softly. AOC's fingers hovered over her keyboard. "Not a statement," she murmured. Then in one fluid motion, she pressed send. It was just a tweet. No hashtags, no images, no fiery rhetoric. 3 simple words: truth doesn't need a permission slip. The message hit screens within seconds. Notifications cascaded across phones worldwide from New York to Nairobi. Twitter froze under the weight of retweets, replies, and quote tweets that split evenly between admiration and outrage. A CNN anchor read the line aloud on air, their voice caught between disbelief and respect. On TikTok, creators began overlaying the text on clips of her, confronting Roberts' soundtrack by swelling instrumentals or sharp beats, each edit more viral than the last. In Washington, Roberts' aides huddled in his office. One whispered she didn't even name him. Another replied she didn't have to. The Chief Justice sat still, his hands folded neatly in front of him, eyes fixed on the marble floor, as if searching for a crack. Across the country, reactions split like lightning. At a laundromat in Chicago, a man reading the tweet on his phone muttered to no one, "She's not fighting them on their field. She's building her own." In a Miami apartment, a law student laughed under his breath, shaking his head. "That's it. That's the whole play." Outside the Supreme Court, the crowd swelled again as more signs appeared overnight. "Permission denied. Truth is not a crime. She said it for all of us." Back in AOC's office, the atmosphere was tense but focused. A young staffer, eyes fixed on a monitor showing live coverage, whispered to his colleague, "It's too quiet. This feels like the calm before something bigger." His colleague didn't look away from the screen. "It's not calm," she said. "It's a warning." The screen flickered to life without warning. No countdown timer, no promo graphics, just Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sitting alone in her district office, the faint hum of city traffic audible behind her. Her hair was pulled back loosely, no makeup, no stage lighting, only the soft glow of a desk lamp cutting shadows across her face. The live stream notifications spread like wildfire. Phones pinged, laptop tabs refreshed. Within 5 minutes, over 3 million viewers were watching. Comments flooded in so fast the scrolling text became a blur. "She's live. This is it. Stay quiet. Just listen." AOC leaned slightly forward, her hands clasped loosely on the desk. She didn't speak right away. Instead, her eyes swept across the screen as though meeting each viewer one by one. When her voice came, it was calm, unhurried, yet sharp enough to cut through the noise of a country on edge. "The real fight isn't loud," she said, her tone almost conversational. "It's steady." The words hung in the air, carrying a weight that felt heavier because of the softness they arrived in. She shifted slightly in her chair, glancing down at a notepad beside her. No speeches, no bullet points, just a few handwritten words only she could see. "I've been asked why I didn't fire back after the press release. Why I stayed quiet," she continued, her gaze lifting again. But silence isn't surrender. Sometimes it's strategy, and sometimes it's respect for the people who deserve to speak loudest. In living rooms, cafes, and subway cars, people leaned closer to their screens. A man in a Denver bar murmured to his friend, "She's not even raising her voice." His friend nodded. "That's why it's hitting harder." AOC drew in a slow breath. "This isn't about me and one justice. It's not about headlines or hashtags. It's about a system where power protects itself, where questions get labeled disrespectful and transparency gets painted as an attack." She paused, letting the words settle. "We've seen this before, and we'll see it again, unless we decide steady isn't enough anymore." The comments section exploded. 3.2M watching. "This is bigger than a hearing." She's framing the whole conversation differently. A TikTok user clipped the live stream mid-broadcast, overlaying her words with captions. "The real fight isn't loud, it's steady." Within minutes, it trended. Back in the Supreme Court, aides passed around their phones, silently watching the numbers climb. One whispered, "This isn't a response, it's an escalation." Another replied, "No, it's a reframing." AOC didn't flinch as the viewer count ticked past 3.5 million. Her voice remained level, her words deliberate. "People ask me if I'm afraid. The answer is yes. But fear isn't an end. It's a beginning if you let it be." She leaned back slightly, her hands resting open on the desk. "The question isn't who's afraid. It's who moves anyway." Across the country, a grandmother in Detroit wiped her eyes with a dish towel. "She's saying what we couldn't for so long," she whispered to no one. In a packed apartment in Queens, 5 college students sat cross-legged on the floor, one muttering, "This feels like history." But AOC didn't declare victory. She didn't call for protests or donations. She simply ended with, "Keep watching, keep asking, keep steady." Then she reached forward, her finger tapping the screen, and the live stream ended without fanfare. 3 million people were left staring at a blank feed, hearts pounding, unsure what would come next. The corridors of Capitol Hill pulsed with an energy rarely felt outside of a State of the Union night. Behind closed doors, clusters of lawmakers gathered in huddled conversations, voices low but urgent. Some rooms were tense, with clipped words and narrowed eyes. Others vibrated with cautious optimism. Phones buzzed incessantly as staffers darted between offices, carrying whispers and memos that seemed to change tone every hour. In a corner of the Republican cloakroom, 2 senior members leaned close over a stack of briefing papers. "She's cracked the marble facade," one murmured, his voice barely above a breath. The other didn't answer, only tightened his grip on a pen and stared at the wall as if seeing it for the first time. On the Democratic side, the mood was no less fractured. In a conference room dimly lit by an overhead projector, junior and senior members argued in hushed tones. One congresswoman, her arms crossed, tightly whispered, "She's reckless. This isn't how we build consensus." A younger colleague shot back, "Consensus hasn't fixed a damn thing in decades." The room fell silent for a beat before someone cleared their throat and asked what everyone was thinking. Do we back her, or do we brace for the fallout? Elsewhere, a Republican representative thumbed through a printout of AOC's livestream transcript. He muttered to his aide, "She didn't even attack directly. She just exposed." The aide nodded, eyes darting to the hallway, where more members passed, their voices blending into an indistinct hum of strategy and fear. Cable news reflected the same divides playing out in real time. Pundits spoke over one another on split screens, their chyrons framing the moment in starkly different lights. MSNBC's read AOC spurs ethics conversation in Washington. Fox countered with Democrat grandstanding threatens judicial integrity. CNN opted for ambiguity, Congress in turmoil over SCOTUS debate. Back in a quiet office tucked away from the main halls, a veteran senator stared out the window at the Capitol dome glowing under floodlights. "This isn't just noise anymore," he said to his chief of staff. "It's movement, and movements are harder to contain." Down the hall, 2 Republican aides whispered as they passed a group of reporters. "What's our line if this snowballs?" one asked. The other replied flatly, "Same as always, preserve the institution. But this time, I'm not sure it'll hold." In the Democratic caucus, texts flew back and forth between members who had once publicly praised AOC and those who had kept their distance. A screenshot of her tweet, "Truth doesn't need a permission slip," floated from phone to phone, like a digital banner for two camps forming beneath the surface. One side argued she was risking too much. The other insisted that risking nothing had brought them here. In the marble hallways outside the House chamber, cameras caught flashes of expression as lawmakers ducked in and out of meetings, furrowed brows, tight lips, eyes that refused to meet the lenses following them. A reporter caught up to a Republican congressman as he exited a side door. "Do you think AOC crossed a line?" The congressman's eyes flicked sideways before he answered coolly, "Lines only matter if people still believe in them." Meanwhile, Roberts remained silent, but the chatter surrounding him was anything but. Clerks inside the court spoke in whispers to trusted journalists, off the record, describing an atmosphere of careful calculation and unspoken worry. One reporter noted in their notebook, "Even marble can chip if struck enough times." By late afternoon, the divisions had hardened. In committee rooms and private offices, members spoke of votes, hearings, and possible resolutions. But beneath the procedural talk was a deeper current, one that no bill or motion could contain. The quiet realization was dawning across the Hill. Whatever came next, the ground had already shifted. Across America, living rooms, classrooms, and coffee shops buzzed with conversations that felt heavier than headlines. In a small house in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a mother and her son sat at a worn kitchen table, a laptop propped between them, streaming AOC's livestream replay. The boy, a first-year law student, watched silently, elbows resting on textbooks piled high. His mother, eyes fixed on the screen, spoke softly, but with a certainty that quieted the room. "That's what courage looks like," she said. He didn't answer, only nodded slowly, as though the words needed time to settle. In Atlanta, a group of workers on their lunch break crowded around a cracked iPad, the room still except for the occasional hum of a vending machine. One man shook his head and whispered, "She didn't even raise her voice, and it shook the whole damn building." Across the table, a woman responded, "That's because she wasn't talking to them. She was talking to us." A pause followed, the kind that says more than words ever could. The ripple effect reached classrooms too. At a high school in Chicago, a history teacher pulled up a news clip mid-lesson. Students watched as captions replayed her line, "Truth doesn't need a permission slip." One senior muttered under his breath, "She's not even my rep, and I feel like she's fighting for me." The teacher didn't reply, just let the silence stretch, knowing the weight of the moment would do its own teaching. Online hashtags continued to surge. "Not above the law," "Franching courage in Congress," "Rana, she spoke for us." Videos of AOC's testimony were stitched alongside everyday Americans sharing their own stories of feeling unseen in courtrooms, workplaces, and schools. A truck driver in Missouri recorded a TikTok from his cab. "I never cared about politics much," he admitted to the camera, "but when she said what she said, it felt like someone finally opened the damn window." News outlets, caught between reporting and reacting, filled their hours with panel discussions and live updates. Analysts debated the long-term implications, but every so often a clip would air of an ordinary person, an elderly woman from Phoenix, a college student in Boston, offering quiet, raw commentary that seemed to resonate more deeply than any expert take. At a diner in Des Moines, an elderly man folded his newspaper, shaking his head. "I've been waiting 60 years for someone to call it out like that," he told the waitress, topping off his coffee. She smiled faintly and said, "Maybe now they'll have to listen." Meanwhile, in a small apartment in Queens, a young single mother scrolled through her phone as her baby slept in a playpen nearby. She replayed the clip where AOC calmly slid forward the folder of evidence. "She didn't flinch," the woman whispered to herself. Her thumb hovered over the share button before she finally tapped it, sending the video to her entire contact list with 3 words, "Watch this, please." The wave wasn't loud, not yet, but it was steady, relentless like water against stone. And somewhere inside Capitol Hill, those who had dismissed it as noise began to realize it wasn't fading. It was growing. The office was dimly lit, save for the soft glow of computer screens and the muted flash of phones vibrating endlessly on desks. Outside, the sound of distant sirens mixed with the low hum of traffic, but inside it was quiet in that tense, brittle way that only comes after a storm. The inboxes were overflowing, some with subject lines in all caps screaming threats, others written with trembling gratitude. Trader One email spat in bold black letters. 2 lines down, another whispered, "Thank you for being the voice we never had." Staffers moved quickly but cautiously, sorting messages into folders, their eyes darting to the door each time footsteps echoed in the hallway. AOC sat alone at her desk, shoulders slightly hunched, a pile of printed letters in her lap. She turned them over one by one, her fingers lingering on the paper, as if absorbing the weight of each word. One was from a retired nurse in Alabama. "You reminded me of why I taught my children to speak up, even when it cost them friends." Another came from a public defender in Kansas City. "Watching you made me cry in my car during lunch break. I've been fighting this system alone for so long." A staffer entered, quietly holding another stack of envelopes. More came in, she said softly, placing them gently on the corner of the desk. "We're at nearly 12,000 emails. Hundreds of voicemails, too." AOC looked up briefly, offering a faint nod. "How many threats?" The staffer hesitated. "More than the usual. But the support outweighs them. It's not even close." AOC didn't smile. She simply exhaled a slow, controlled breath and reached for the next envelope. Across the room, a junior aide stared at a spreadsheet tallying supportive versus hostile messages. "It's like half the country wants to hug her," he murmured to no one in particular, "and the other half wants her gone." His colleague, eyes still on her screen, replied quietly, "That's what happens when you touch something they said was untouchable." On social media, the tidal wave hadn't slowed. Supporters posted screenshots of their letters, hashtags still trending days after the live stream. "Russia, we stand with AOC, not above the law, courage in Congress." Opponents filled comment sections with calls for censure and removal. But in nearly every thread, one refrain emerged again and again. "At least she had the guts to say it out loud." In Washington, the ripple of fear was less visible, but no less real. Fellow lawmakers whispered in elevators, glancing nervously around them. A Republican senator was overheard telling his aide, "I don't like her methods, but God help us, she's not wrong." The aide didn't answer, instead tightening his grip on his phone as if holding back words of his own. Back in AOC's office, another letter unfolded in her hands. It was written in neat cursive by a grandmother from Phoenix. "You don't know me, but my grandson watched you. He said, 'She looks like us.' That's enough for me." AOC's eyes traced the lines twice before folding it carefully and setting it aside. She glanced at her staff, who were still sorting through the storm of messages with steady hands and tired eyes. "No press responses yet," she said quietly. "Not until we decide what's next." But even as she spoke, outside the office walls, the Capitol buzzed with movement. Meetings were called in hushed urgency. Drafts of statements circulated between party leaders. Somewhere down the hall, a senior congressman muttered as he passed a reporter, "She's opened a door we can't close again." The Supreme Court chambers were unusually quiet that evening, the kind of heavy silence that clings even after everyone else has gone home. The blinds were drawn, shutting out the last streaks of sunlight, and the faint hum of the air conditioning felt louder than it should. Chief Justice John Roberts sat at the long mahogany table in his private office, hands folded neatly in front of him, his posture straight, but his shoulders betraying a tension he couldn't smooth away. Across from him, his senior aide shifted uneasily, a legal pad resting untouched on his lap. Roberts broke the stillness with a voice low but firm. "We cannot let this define the court." The words hung in the air, heavy as the marble columns outside. He spoke them like an order, but there was a trace of something else beneath the flicker of doubt, the kind that lingers in the space between conviction and recognition. The aide didn't answer right away. His eyes drifted down to the folder on the table, the same folder that now appeared in news stories, viral clips, and late-night monologues. It bore no official seal, just AOC's calm handwriting on the cover, Judicial Policy Center, undisclosed financial ties. He shifted again, his pen rolling off the pad and clattering softly against the floor. "It already has," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Roberts's jaw tightened. For a moment, he stared at the aide as though trying to will him into silence, into retreat. But the younger man held his gaze for once, his own expression taut, weary from the week's relentless headlines. The chief's fingers drummed once on the wood before stilling again. "Public perception is not precedent," he said. "We weather storms by staying above them." The aide swallowed hard. "Sir, this isn't weather. It's erosion." Somewhere in the building, a clock chimed softly, marking the hour. Roberts glanced toward it instinctively, as though time might offer him an answer. Instead, his reflection in the polished wood stared back calm, composed but with a faint crease in the brow that hadn't been there years ago. Outside these walls, cable networks continued their looping debates. CNN dissected every word of his previous press release. MSNBC replayed AOC's quiet but cutting line. Truth doesn't need a permission slip over footage of protests gathering outside the court. Fox News framed the moment as a partisan attack on judicial independence, but even their anchors seemed unable to ignore the cracks forming in the court's public image. Roberts leaned back slightly, fingers steepled, now his voice quieter. Do you know what it's like to spend decades guarding an institution's reputation only to watch it unravel in a week? The aide hesitated, unsure whether to answer. The chief continued before he could speak. Every ruling, every dissent, every word measured to preserve the illusion of neutrality. He let out a slow breath. And now that illusion is being shredded by a single congressional hearing and a tweet. The aide shifted his weight, his eyes flicking briefly to the door, as if checking for unseen ears. Maybe it wasn't as neutral as we believed, he said softly. Roberts's eyes narrowed not in anger but in something closer to reflection. His thumb rubbed at the edge of the table. The court cannot become a symbol of corruption. It cannot. The aide looked down again, hands clasped tightly together. But it already has in the minds of millions. His voice carried no accusation, only the blunt force of truth that had no place to hide anymore. The chief said nothing. For a long moment, the room was filled only with the distant sound of traffic outside and the faint ticking of the clock. Somewhere deep down, he knew the aide was right. He'd felt the shift not in rulings, not in legal briefs, but in the way people spoke about the court now, in the way even his own clerks whispered in hallways when they thought he wasn't listening. And for the first time in years, John Roberts wondered if history's memory would care more about the votes he'd cast or the silences he'd kept. By midweek, the echoes from the hearing had grown into something no one on Capitol Hill could contain. Civil rights organizations from across the country filed petitions calling for sweeping judicial reforms. Headlines shifted from questions of ethics to demands for action. Coalition of 47 advocacy groups, calls for Supreme Court Transparency Act blared across CNN's bottom ticker. On MSNBC, legal analysts debated draft proposals for mandatory financial disclosures, while Fox News ran segments accusing activist groups of weaponizing public outrage. But in coffee shops and dorm rooms, it wasn't policy papers people were sharing, it was a meme. The image showed AOC at the hearing, eyes locked on Roberts across the polished table. The caption in bold white letters read simply, "Power blinks." By noon, it had been reposted more than 2 million times on Instagram alone. TikTok users remixed the clip into short, punchy edits with soundtracks ranging from Beethoven's Symphony No. "I've to Kendrick Lamar's All Right." Each iteration seemed to tighten the narrative, one woman unflinching, staring down an entire institution. In Los Angeles, a group of law students organized an impromptu sit-in at their university's courtyard, holding printed copies of Roberts' previous rulings alongside posters that read, "We deserve better." A professor watching from a window murmured to a colleague, "This isn't a moment anymore, it's momentum." On Capitol Hill, lawmakers scrambled. A bipartisan ethics bill that had languished for months suddenly reappeared on committee calendars. Behind closed doors, aides whispered about polling shifts and constituent emails pouring in by the thousands. "They're not asking us to comment," one Republican staffer said grimly. "They're asking us where we stand." Meanwhile, AOC's office remained outwardly calm. She made no new statements, gave no interviews. Yet the silence wasn't empty, it was strategic. Her aides fielded media requests around the clock, quietly coordinating with advocacy groups and community leaders, while their inbox continued filling with messages of support. One intern scrolling through viral tweets held up her phone and whispered, "It's everywhere. Even my uncle, who never talks politics, sent me this meme." Inside the Supreme Court, the mood was equally tense. Clerks moved briskly through halls, avoiding eye contact. Roberts kept to his chambers, canceling a scheduled lecture at Georgetown Law. He reviewed upcoming cases, but his thoughts kept returning to the image, her eyes steady, unyielding. The phrase "power blinks" looped in his mind like an unwelcome refrain, and in the streets outside, protest signs bobbed above growing crowds. Some were handwritten in marker, others were professionally printed, but all carried variations of the same message. Accountability isn't radical. Truth doesn't need permission. This is our court too. For the first time in years, the court's marble steps seemed less like a symbol of permanence and more like a stage for reckoning. The chamber lights of Congress burned late into the night as lawmakers filed in, their voices hushed but edged with urgency. On the agenda was a bill few had expected to see debated this soon, the Judicial Transparency Act. Stacks of briefing papers covered desks, pages marked with highlighter and hastily scribbled notes. The sound of shuffling papers and murmured strategy filled the air, punctuated occasionally by the gavel as debate opened. One representative leaned close to her colleague, her voice low. "We're not debating because we want to. We're debating because the country's watching." Outside the chamber, the press waited in thick clusters. Cameras flashed. Reporters spoke in rapid bursts into microphones, updating live feeds. Momentum for reform has surged after weeks of public pressure, one anchor explained as footage rolled of crowds gathered on the Capitol steps. Their signs waved in unison, carrying words like, "No more secrets," and "Our court, our rules." Inside speeches began. Some argued for restraint, citing separation of powers and judicial independence. Others pressed hard for accountability, their voices rising in crescendos that drew murmurs from the gallery. "The American people deserve to know when justice is compromised," one congressman said, his hand pounding the lectern. A few rows back, a younger representative whispered to a staffer, "This isn't just legislation, it's a reckoning." The ripple of AOC's confrontation was still felt in every corner of the debate. Even those who had once dismissed her as performative now spoke cautiously, aware of the clips still circulating online, her calm voice, her steady gaze, and the folder placed deliberately on the table. That image had become more than viral. It had become symbolic. In the gallery, a reporter tapped quickly at his phone, live tweeting the debate. He paused only long enough to jot a note in his pad. She changed the conversation. Back in her office, AOC watched the proceedings in silence on a small screen, her staff bustling around her with updates and requests. She didn't speak, only nodded occasionally, her face unreadable. Outside her window, the distant glow of protest signs was visible even through the thick Capitol glass. Across the country, living rooms and coffee shops stayed tuned in. In Detroit, a retired union worker muttered to himself, "It took one woman to make them flinch." At a cafe in Portland, a law student whispered to her friend, "This feels like more than politics. It feels like a crack in the armor." And in the Senate, whispers grew louder as senators exchanged glances over their stacks of notes. No one said it outright, but they all felt it. The system wasn't just under scrutiny, it was exposed. The office was dim except for the glow of her laptop screen. AOC sat still, her hands folded as the livestream counter ticked upward, thousands watching, waiting. Her voice was calm but edged with quiet resolve. "Do we stay quiet to keep our seats, or speak and risk losing them?" The comments section erupted instantly, words flying faster than she could read. "Say it louder. We've got your back. Never stop." She didn't reply, only let the silence stretch as her eyes held steady on the camera. Outside her window, distant chants echoed in the night. As the hearing adjourned, AOC gathered her folders with deliberate care, her expression unreadable. The room buzzed with murmurs, but she moved through it like a current cutting against the tide. Outside the chamber, the marble floor reflected the warm gold of a setting sun, spilling through tall windows. She paused at the threshold, a faint silhouette against the glow, and for a moment the air felt heavier, as if history itself was holding its breath. In the stillness, a quiet thought echoed like a promise. Power can survive silence, but once questioned, it never fully sleeps again. Would you like me to now stitch all these parts, 7 chapters together into one seamless 12,000-word draft so it flows naturally as a full story, keeping the same tone, pace, and vivid emotional impact? Or do you want me to also enhance it with stronger emotional highs and sharper twists for max engagement before stitching? Sometimes courage isn't a roar, it's the sound of marble cracking when one generation finally refuses to kneel. Watching AOC stand in that hall reminded me power doesn't shatter overnight. It trembles first. And it only trembles when those who built the marble dare to strike it. History doesn't ask who watched it, remembers who struck. When your grandchildren ask what you did when silence ruled, will you tell them you cracked the marble, or will they find your name carved beneath it, silent forever? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.